The mayor's hand was shaking when he called. I could hear it in the way his breath caught between words, the slight tremor that phone speakers amplify. He asked if I was sitting down. I was standing in my kitchen with coffee going cold in my cup, looking at the rain that had been falling for 36 hours straight, and I told him I was fine standing. That was when he said the bridge was still up. Not damaged, not compromised, still carrying traffic while the river underneath had risen 14 feet and counting. He said my name twice, like he was trying to convince himself I was real. Then he asked if I would come to his office the following morning. I set the phone down and looked at my hands. They were steady. I'd been fired from that project 16 months earlier, escorted from the construction site by security while my calculations and drawings remained in file cabinets I would never access again. My supervisor had stood in the parking lot with his arms crossed, watching me load my toolbox into my truck, and he had said something I still remembered word for word. He said the work would continue just fine without me, that I had been replaceable all along, and that in 5 years nobody would even remember my name. I had driven home in silence that day and never gone back. Now the bridge I designed was holding against a 100-year storm, and the mayor wanted to see me. I rinsed my coffee cup and set it in the drainer. My daughter had been asking for weeks if I was eating enough. She worried in that quiet way she had inherited from her mother by noticing small things and mentioning them carefully. I had been eating fine. I had been sleeping fine. I had been living the way a man does when he knows he built something right and then got pushed aside for knowing it. The rain drummed against the window, and I thought about load calculations and hydrostatic pressure and the way water moves when it has no choice but to go around something solid. I had turned 49 the week I was fired. Not old, but old enough to understand that competence does not insulate you from office politics or budget cuts or the kind of ambition that mistakes credentials for vision. I had worked for the city's engineering department for 22 years, moving through projects with the methodical attention my father had taught me when I was young enough to hold a level, but not yet strong enough to lift lumber. He had been a carpenter, and he used to say that wood does not lie. If your measurements are wrong, the frame will tell you. I carried that into concrete and steel, into span ratios and soil compression, and I never cut corners because corners are where failures start. The bridge project had started 3 years before the firing. The city needed to replace the old crossing that had been patched and reinforced so many times, the structural surveys read like medical charts for a terminal patient. The river was a commercial route, and the bridge carried commuter traffic from 2 counties, which meant the new design had to handle heavy loads and allow barge clearance, and survive the kind of flooding that came every decade or so when the weather upstream forgot its manners. I was assigned as lead structural engineer. My supervisor was a man named Dalhoff, recently promoted from another department, and he had a degree from a prominent school and a confidence that seemed to grow louder the less he understood. We started well enough. I submitted preliminary designs that accounted for the river's history, the soil reports, the traffic projections the transportation consultants provided. I specified pier depths that would anchor below the scour line, deck reinforcement that would handle expansion and contraction through summer heat and winter cold, and a drainage system that would move water off the roadway faster than any storm could deposit it. Dalhoff approved the plans with minimal comments. The city council approved the budget. Construction began the following spring. I visited the site 3 times a week, sometimes more. I watched the excavation crews dig pier foundations and the concrete trucks arrive before dawn to pour in the coolest hours. I checked rebar placement and monitored curing schedules and made notes in a field book that I kept in my truck. The contractors were professionals who had built infrastructure across the state, and they respected precision. The foreman, a man named Cray, would call me when he had questions, and we would walk the site together, discussing grades and alignments and whether a sensor reading made sense. It was good work. It felt like building something that would outlast all of us. The problem started when Dalhoff hired an assistant, a younger engineer named Pruitt, who had worked for a private firm in another city. Pruitt arrived with ideas about value engineering, which is a term that sounds responsible until you realize it often means spending less money in ways that create long-term risk. He began attending site meetings and suggesting modifications, shorter pier depths, thinner deck sections, a simplified drainage design that would save the city $60,000. I explained why each change would compromise the structure's resilience, and I provided calculations to support my position. Dalhoff listened to Pruitt. He said the budget was under pressure and the council wanted results, and he asked if I was being too conservative. I was not being too conservative. I was being correct. But correctness is not a defense when someone above you has already decided you are an obstacle. The confrontation happened in a conference room on a Tuesday morning. Dalhoff and Pruitt presented a revised plan to the project committee, a plan I had not reviewed or approved, and it included every cost-saving measure I had rejected. I stood at the back of the room and waited until they finished, and then I said, the changes would create failure points that could manifest under load or during a flood event. I said it calmly. I did not raise my voice. I cited the geotechnical studies and the hydraulic models and the traffic data. Pruitt responded by saying my concerns were theoretical and that modern construction methods had evolved beyond the conservative practices I was clinging to. He said it with a smile, like he was trying to be kind. Dalhoff thanked me for my input and said the committee would take my concerns under advisement. 2 weeks later, I received a meeting notice from Human Resources. The termination letter cited budget restructuring and a need to streamline project leadership. Dalhoff walked me to my truck that afternoon and made his comment about being forgotten, and I drove home thinking about all the ways institutions protect themselves by erasing the people who inconvenience them. I did not fight it. I could have filed a grievance, but I knew how those processes worked. I could have gone to the press, but city politics are insular and reporters lose interest when the story requires engineering knowledge to understand. I could have called the contractors, but they had families and contracts and no incentive to jeopardize their livelihoods for a fired engineer. So I stayed quiet. I collected unemployment for a few months and then found consulting work with a private firm 2 counties away, designing stormwater systems in parking garages and the kind of projects that do not carry your name. I told my daughter I was fine when she visited. I told my neighbors I had retired early when they asked. I did not tell anyone that I checked the construction reports online every week, watching the bridge progress toward completion without me, wondering if my warnings would prove justified, or if I had been wrong all along. The bridge opened 14 months after I was fired. There was a ribbon cutting. The mayor gave a speech about infrastructure investment and community progress. Dalhoff was photographed shaking hands with the contractors. My name did not appear in any of the press releases or dedication plaques. Pruitt's did. I saw the photos online and felt nothing, which surprised me. I thought I would feel anger or bitterness, but what I felt was a kind of clinical curiosity, the same feeling you get when you see storm clouds forming and you wonder if they will produce lightning or just rain. Then the weather changed. It started with a low-pressure system that stalled over the watershed upstream, dumping rain at a rate the forecasters described as exceptional. The river began to rise. Water that normally flowed at 7 feet above datum climbed to 10, then 12, then 15. The city issued flood warnings and closed the riverside parks and moved sandbags into position at the low-lying neighborhoods. I watched the news and checked the gauges that the Geological Survey published online, and I calculated flow rates in my head while I ate dinner alone in my kitchen. The bridge was designed for a flood elevation of 16 feet, which was the 100-year benchmark the historical data supported. The river was approaching that threshold with 2 more days of rain forecasted. I did not sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the pier depths Pruitt had shortened, the drainage system he had simplified, the deck thickness he had reduced. I thought about hydrostatic pressure and turbulence and the way water undermines foundations when it moves fast enough. I thought about the traffic that would be crossing that bridge the next morning, the commuters who trusted that the structure above them had been built correctly, and I realized I was holding my breath. The rain continued. The river crested at 18 feet, 2 feet above the design threshold, and it stayed there for 30 hours. I drove to a vantage point on the east bluff where you could see the bridge from a distance, and I stood in the rain with binoculars and watched the water move. The deck was clear. The piers were stable. The approach ramps were draining correctly. Traffic continued to flow, slower than usual but uninterrupted, and I realized that the design I had created was performing exactly as I had intended. The modifications Pruitt had insisted on had been overruled at some point, or had never been implemented, or had been less severe than I feared. I did not know which, but the bridge was holding. I went home and dried off and waited for the phone to ring. The mayor's call came the next morning, and now I was sitting in his office with a view of the bridge through the window behind his desk. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe it was just the exhaustion that comes from managing a crisis. He offered me coffee and I accepted, and he poured it himself, which seemed significant in a way I did not fully understand yet. Dalhoff was not in the room. Pruitt was not in the room. It was just the mayor and a woman from the city attorney's office who introduced herself but whose name I immediately forgot because I was focused on the folder the mayor was holding. He opened it and slid a document across the desk. It was a construction audit, the kind of review that gets triggered when something goes very right or very wrong. The summary stated that the bridge had been completed within 2% of the original specifications I had designed, and that the modifications proposed by Pruitt had been rejected by the primary contractor after an independent review flagged them as non-compliant with safety codes. The contractor had contacted Dalhoff, who had quietly authorized the restoration of my original plans without informing the project committee or updating the budget documents. The bridge had been built the way I intended, but the credit had gone elsewhere. The mayor said they were opening a formal investigation into project management practices. He said they were reviewing all the documentation, and he wanted to know if I would be willing to provide testimony or consulting support. He said, "The city owed me an acknowledgement at minimum, and possibly more depending on what the attorney's office recommended." He did not apologize directly, but his tone carried the weight of someone who understood that institutions fail people, and that those failures have names attached. I asked him why the audit had been conducted. He said the bridge's performance during the flood had prompted questions from the county engineers, who had been monitoring the structure remotely and had expected to see stress indicators that never materialized. They had requested the construction records to understand why the bridge had exceeded expectations, and the records had revealed discrepancies between the approved plans and the budget reports. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared enough to look. I told the mayor I would help however I could, and I asked him one question. I asked him if Dalhoff knew about this meeting. He said Dalhoff had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome, and that Pruitt had resigned 3 days earlier. He said it quietly, like he was telling me something I already knew, and maybe I did. I left his office and drove to the bridge. I parked on the shoulder and walked to the center span, where the deck met the main piers and the river flowed 16 feet below. The water had receded to 14 feet by then, but you could still see the debris caught in the upstream eddies, the branches and trash and pieces of docks that the current had carried downstream. I put my hand on the railing and felt the vibration of traffic passing behind me, the subtle harmonic that every structure produces when it is loaded and alive. The concrete was cool under my palm, and the steel hummed in a frequency I had calculated 3 years earlier when I was sitting at my desk with a pencil and a pad of engineering paper, trying to imagine what this moment would feel like. I had imagined it would feel like vindication, but what it felt like was responsibility. The bridge was not mine anymore. It belonged to the city and the people who used it, and the river that flowed beneath it. I had built it to last, and it was lasting. And that was the only thing that mattered. 3 months later, the investigation concluded. Dalhoff was terminated for project mismanagement and financial irregularities. Pruitt's resignation was accepted without contest. The City Council issued a formal acknowledgement of my contributions to the bridge project, and they announced that the structure would be named in my honor during a dedication ceremony the following spring. My daughter called me crying when she heard the news, happy tears that made her voice break, in the same way her mother's used to when she was proud of something I had done. I told her it was just a bridge, and she told me it was never just a bridge. The ceremony was quiet and efficient, the way I preferred. The mayor spoke briefly about integrity and competence, and a small plaque was installed at the east approach with my name and the dates of my service. Reporters asked me how it felt to be recognized, and I told them it felt like the system had worked the way it was supposed to, slowly and imperfectly, but eventually. They printed that quote in the local paper, under a photograph of me, standing beside the plaque with my hands in my pockets, looking more tired than triumphant. I went back to my consulting work. I designed stormwater systems and reviewed site plans, and occasionally provided expert testimony in cases where structures had failed and someone needed to explain why. I did not tell clients about the bridge unless they asked, and most of them did not ask. My daughter visited more often, and she stopped asking if I was eating enough because she could see that I was fine. I was better than fine. I was exactly where I needed to be. The bridge still stands. I drive across it sometimes when I have business in the city, and I feel the same vibration in the steering wheel that I felt in the railing that day. I walk to the center span. The concrete has weathered slightly, and the steel has a patina that comes from exposure and use, but the structure is sound. It will be sound for another 70 years if the maintenance schedules are followed, and probably longer if the city hires people who understand that infrastructure is a promise made to the future. I do not think about Dalhoff or Pruitt anymore. They made choices that served their ambitions, and those choices caught up with them the way bad engineering always does when the loads increase. I made choices that served the work, and the work lasted. That is the only accounting that matters. My father used to say that wood does not lie, and I learned that concrete and steel do not lie either. They perform according to the forces applied and the quality of the design. They do not care about politics or recognition or who gets credit. They simply exist in the world, doing what they were built to do, and if you built them correctly, they will outlast your memory of building them. The bridge carries traffic every day. Commuters cross it without thinking about the piers below or the calculations that determined their depth. They do not know my name unless they read the plaque, and most of them do not read the plaque. They simply drive across and continue to wherever they are going, trusting that the structure will hold, because structures are supposed to hold. That trust is the entire point. I gave them a bridge they could trust, and it trusted them back by not failing. That is all I ever wanted to build.